Ma'am, step away from the door. We got reports you broke in here.
This is my home. What reports are you talking about?
Don't give me attitude. Someone like you doesn't live in a neighborhood like this.
Someone like me? What does that mean, officer?
Just shut up and show me ID or you're going in handcuffs right now.
This is what happens when police racially profile a federal judge. 8 years prison. 3M unpaid cop. Ma'am, step away from the door. We got reports you broke in here. Victim. This is my home. What reports are you talking about? Creep, don't give me attitude. Someone like you doesn't live in a neighborhood like this. Victim, someone like me. What does that mean, officer? Cop, just shut up and show me ID, or you're going in handcuffs right now. The 62-year-old woman standing in silk pajamas had no idea these officers just made a career-ending mistake. What happened next would send both men to federal prison and expose a police department's darkest secrets. The body camera footage you're about to see became evidence in the most explosive civil rights case in state history. If you're watching from anywhere in America, hit subscribe because the evidence they tried to hide will shock you. This isn't just another police misconduct story. This is what happens when racist cops break into the wrong house and it belongs to a federal judge. Here's how it started that Tuesday morning. Fan 1, the perfect target, 252. The morning tea was still steaming when Judge Evelyn Harris heard the commotion outside. She had been up since 5:30, like always, tending to the rose bushes her late husband had planted before the cancer took him 3 years ago. At 62, Judge Harris had spent the last 12 years on the federal bench, appointed after 15 years as a civil rights attorney fighting housing discrimination cases. The kind of cases where she'd seen families just like hers denied mortgages in neighborhoods just like this one. She lived quietly in the modest colonial she'd purchased after James died, using the life insurance money he'd insisted they get. The house wasn't fancy, just comfortable. 3 bedrooms, a small garden, and a porch where she'd sit with her case files every morning before heading downtown to the courthouse. The neighbors knew her as the woman who brought cookies to the annual block party and helped Mrs. Patterson next door carry groceries when her arthritis flared up. She drove a 10-year-old Honda, did her own yard work, and kept to herself mostly. That Tuesday morning started like any other. She'd been outside in her silk pajamas and robe, watering the roses before the sun got too high, when she noticed the patrol car slowing down. Nothing unusual about that. Police cruised through the neighborhood regularly, but something about the way they pulled into her driveway made her pause. The aggressive way both officers stepped out, hands already moving to their belts. The way they looked at her like she was trespassing on her own property. Fan 2, the trigger 202. Officer Blake Morrison had been a cop for 14 years. At 38, he'd worked this district long enough to know every street, every regular resident. Or so he thought. When he saw the black woman in pajamas watering flowers at 6:47 in the morning, something triggered in his mind. This was an upscale neighborhood, mostly white, mostly older professionals. He had never seen her before. His partner, Kyle Jensen, was younger, only 29, with 5 years on the force. He followed Morrison's lead on everything. Morrison grabbed his radio. Dispatch, we've got a possible 459 in progress at 1847 Maple Ridge Drive. Suspicious person on property. We're going to make contact. There had been no 911 call, no homeowner report, no actual suspicion of any crime. It was a fabricated reason to justify what Morrison had already decided to do, check on why this black woman was at this house in this neighborhood. Jensen followed his partner up the driveway, both men's hands resting on their belts in a stance meant to intimidate. They'd done this before, stopping people who didn't look like they belonged. Usually those people cooperated, quickly explained themselves, and moved on. Usually, see. Fan 3, the confrontation. 282. The knocking was aggressive, not the courtesy knock of a neighbor or delivery person, but the authoritative pounding of law enforcement. Judge Harris set down her watering can and walked to the front door, still holding her teacup. Through the window, she could see 2 uniformed officers on her porch. She opened the door. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" Morrison stepped forward. Ma'am, we received a report of a break-in at this address. We need to see some identification. Judge Harris felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the one she'd felt 100 times before in her 62 years. But her voice stayed calm. A break-in. Who reported that? That's not your concern, Jensen said. The homeowner called dispatch about a suspicious person on the property. She took a slow breath. I am the homeowner. This is my house. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Can you prove that? Do you have a warrant? She asked. The question seemed to irritate them. Morrison shifted his stance. We don't need a warrant to investigate a reported crime. Now, are you going to cooperate or are we going to have a problem? Judge Harris made a decision in that moment. She could end this instantly by revealing who she was showing her credentials, watching them backpedal and apologize. But she wanted to see something first. She wanted to see how these officers would treat someone they perceived as powerless, someone who didn't have a federal appointment or a law degree or any protection beyond the Constitution they'd sworn to uphold. What specifically was reported? She asked, keeping her voice level. Morrison's jaw clenched. Your attitude is making you look real suspicious right now, ma'am. Here I'm being fan for illegal entry. 252. Morrison didn't wait for an answer. He placed his hand on the door and pushed it open, stepping into Judge Harris's home without permission. We need to clear the house for officer safety, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this many times before. Jensen followed immediately, both officers now standing in her living room. The violation was complete. Judge Harris felt her heart rate spike, but her voice stayed steady. You're entering my home without a warrant and without my consent. I'm stating that clearly for the record. Morrison turned to face her, irritation flashing across his face. Ma'am, I'm not going to tell you again to cooperate. Judge Harris reached into her robe pocket and pulled out her phone. If they were going to violate her rights, she would document every second of it. She raised the phone and began recording. Morrison's reaction was immediate and violent. He lunged forward, grabbed the phone from her hand and threw it across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. You don't record us without permission, he said. What neither officer knew was that 3 years ago, after her husband died, and she found herself living alone for the first time in decades, Judge Harris had installed a comprehensive security system. 8 cameras covered every entrance and main room of the house. The footage uploaded automatically to cloud storage with crystal clear audio. Every word they spoke, every illegal action they took was being preserved as evidence they couldn't destroy. Fan 5, the violation. 320. Morrison moved through the house like he owned it, opening doors without asking, his partner following close behind. They went into her bedroom first, rifling through drawers where she kept her personal items. Jensen pulled open her closet and started going through her clothes, letting them fall to the floor. In the study, Morrison found the framed law degree from Howard University hanging on the wall. He studied it for a moment, then let out a dismissive laugh. Law degree, he said to Jensen. Probably bought it online. They demanded identification again. Judge Harris, standing in her own living room, watching these men violate her home, refused. You have no legal basis to demand my identification in my own house, she said quietly. That's when Morrison's composure broke completely. The words that came out of his mouth next were designed to humiliate, to put her in what he thought was her place. How does someone like you afford a house like this? He asked, his voice dripping with contempt. You sleeping with somebody. Some rich white man keeping you comfortable? Jensen laughed at that, emboldened by his partner's boldness. Nah, she's probably dealing drugs, pushing something out of this nice house, making the neighborhood look bad. Morrison continued, that's how people like you get into places like this. You don't earn it. You take advantage, you run scams, you do whatever you have to do. For 25 minutes, Judge Harris stood in her own home and endured language she hadn't heard directed at her since she was a young lawyer in the Deep South 40 years ago. She never raised her voice. She never responded to their provocations. She simply repeated calmly and clearly, her request for their supervisor's contact information. In her mind, she was cataloging everything, every word, every illegal action, building the case that would end their careers. Have you ever had to stay calm while someone attacked your dignity? Drop a comment. Your story matters. Fan 6, the reveal, Teeny. 2. The officers finally finished their illegal search. They'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. Just the home of a woman who'd worked her entire life, who'd earned everything she had through sacrifice and dedication to justice. Morrison stood in the living room, flushed with the adrenaline of his power trip. "If we see you here again," he told her, "you're going into jail for trespassing. We're going to contact the real homeowner and let them know someone's been squatting in their house." Judge Harris didn't respond immediately. She walked calmly to her study, opened the top drawer of her desk, and pulled out a leather folder. She carried it back to the living room and placed it on the coffee table in front of both officers. Then she opened it. Inside was her federal judicial commission signed by the President of the United States. Her credentials, her badge, her identification as a sitting federal judge. She said nothing. She simply stood there and watched as the color drained from Morrison's face. Watched as Jensen took an involuntary step backward toward the door, his mouth opening and closing without sound. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the full weight of her authority. "You violated multiple federal laws in my home. Everything you did was recorded. The FBI will have the footage within the hour." Fan 7, immediate fallout, 2:42. The officers practically ran from her house, their confidence evaporating the moment they understood who they'd been abusing. Morrison's hands were shaking as he reached his patrol car. Jensen looked like he might be sick. Judge Harris closed her front door and stood in her violated home for a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she walked to her phone, picked it up from where Morrison had thrown it against the wall, and saw the cracked screen. It didn't matter. The security system had captured everything. 20 minutes later, she made a call to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. As a federal judge, she had direct access to senior agents. Special Agent Marcus Webb answered on the second ring. When she explained what had occurred, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Webb arrived 90 minutes later with a technical team and a federal prosecutor named Linda Chang. They spent the next 3 hours reviewing the security footage from all 8 cameras. The video showed every angle: illegal entry, illegal search, the racial abuse, Morrison grabbing and throwing her phone, the fabricated justification for their presence. Chang watched the footage twice, shaking her head. In 18 years of prosecuting civil rights cases, she said, "I've never seen evidence this clear. These officers documented their own crimes." By late afternoon, the story had broken on local news. The police chief held a hasty press conference announcing both officers had been suspended without pay and promising full cooperation with federal authorities. Fan 8, Systemic Investigation, which 60 TU. The FBI didn't stop with 2 officers. Within days, Special Agent Webb had launched a comprehensive investigation into the entire department's practices. Federal subpoenas went out for 7 years of records arrest, reports, complaint, files, and internal communications. What they found was a pattern that made Judge Harris's case look like the tip of an iceberg. Data analysis revealed that Black residents in affluent zip codes were stopped and questioned 22 times more frequently than white residents in the same neighborhoods. The disparity was so stark it couldn't be explained by any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Internal text messages between supervisors showed jokes about wrong neighborhood checks and comments about certain people not belonging in nice areas. The culture wasn't just tolerating racial profiling, it was encouraging it. Morrison's personnel file contained 15 complaints over 5 years. A neurosurgeon handcuffed while jogging in his own neighborhood. A Black family questioned about whether they really lived in the house where they were loading groceries into their car. A college professor stopped and interrogated while getting his mail. Every single complaint had been dismissed with nothing more than verbal counseling or a memo in the file. Jensen's record showed 8 complaints in 3 years following the same pattern. Young Black professionals, Successful families, educated residents, all targeted for nothing more than existing in spaces where someone decided they didn't belong. The department had protected both officers through what federal investigators called a textbook example of the blue wall of silence. Fan 9, the trial 302, the federal grand jury convened 4 weeks after the incident, unusually fast by government standards. 18 citizens from across the district reviewed the security footage, listened to Judge Harris testify about what she'd endured in her own home, and heard expert witnesses explain each constitutional violation in detail. Judge Harris had recused herself from any official role in the prosecution, but she testified as a victim. She described the fear she felt when armed officers invaded her home, the humiliation of being told she didn't belong in her own neighborhood, the deliberate calculations she'd made to document their behavior rather than immediately reveal her position. Morrison was charged with 8 federal counts: civil rights deprivation under color of law, illegal search and seizure, criminal trespass assault, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, making false official statements, and destruction of evidence. Jensen faced 7 counts, identical except for the assault charge. The trial lasted 9 days. The defense attorneys argued their clients had made an honest mistake and were simply following their training. The prosecution systematically destroyed both claims. They produced dispatch records showing no actual 911 call had ever been made. They played internal text messages where Morrison and Jensen had mocked residents they called uppity and joked about putting people in their place. 3 retired officers testified about the department's culture, describing how racial profiling was an open secret that supervisors ignored or quietly encouraged. The footage played on loop, showing every moment of the violation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on every count. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Families of 37 other victims who had come forward after Judge Harris's case went public wept openly. They'd waited years for someone to believe them, for someone with power to hold these officers accountable. Fan 10 sentencing, 280 M. 2. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months after the verdict. Judge Robert Martinez, a respected jurist with 30 years on the bench, presided over the proceeding. He had no relation to the police chief who'd resigned in disgrace weeks earlier. Before imposing sentence, Judge Martinez allowed Judge Harris to give a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, looked directly at both defendants who couldn't meet her eyes, and spoke for 20 minutes. But she didn't talk about herself. Every Black parent in this city must now sit down with their children and explain that even in your own home, you may not be safe. She said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. Every successful Black citizen who worked their entire life to afford a home in a good neighborhood now wonders if they'll be next. If a federal judge can be violated in her own house, what protection does an ordinary citizen have? She continued, the courtroom absolutely silent. These officers didn't just violate my constitutional rights. They weaponized their badges to reinforce centuries of oppression. They used the authority we gave them to tell me to tell every Black person in this community that we don't belong, that no matter what we achieve, no matter what we earn, we will always be seen as suspects first and citizens second. Judge Martinez took a long moment before speaking. He sentenced Morrison to 9 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Jensen received 7 years under the same terms. The sentences were significantly higher than typical first-time offenses, Martinez explained, due to the profound abuse of position of trust and deliberate targeting of a victim based on race. Police unions immediately condemned the sentences as excessive. Civil rights organizations called them long overdue accountability. Fan 11, Financial Reckoning 2/2022. The criminal convictions opened the floodgates for civil litigation. Judge Harris's attorney negotiated a settlement before trial. The city agreed to pay $8.5 million, the largest individual police misconduct settlement in the state's history. But she wasn't the only one seeking justice. 37 other victims who had been profiled and harassed by Morrison and Jensen filed their own lawsuits over the following months. The city eventually paid out an additional $22 million in settlements over 18 months. The total cost topped $30 million. The city's insurance company responded by canceling their liability coverage and filing suit against the city for gross negligence and supervision. Without insurance, the city faced potential bankruptcy with every new lawsuit. The political fallout was swift. The police chief had already resigned. The mayor announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Four city council members who had repeatedly voted down civilian oversight proposals quietly left office. The Department of Justice imposed a federal consent decree that placed the entire police department under federal oversight for 5 years. The monitoring and reform requirements would cost approximately $4 million annually from the city's already strained budget. Judge Harris took $2 million from her settlement and established a community oversight board with real investigative authority. She agreed to serve as its founding chair, determined to ensure the reforms would outlast the headlines. Fan 12, Destroyers. Grows Fate 202. Morrison entered federal prison 2 weeks after sentencing. He'd been a cop for 14 years, carried a badge, commanded respect. In prison, those credentials meant nothing except making him a target. During his second week, 3 inmates who'd seen his case on the news attacked him in the common area. After that, prison officials moved him to protective custody. He would spend the next 9 years in 23-hour isolation, let out only for 1 hour of recreation in a cage by himself. His wife filed for divorce after 8 months. She took their 2 children and moved across the country to escape the stigma. Morrison's parents stopped visiting after the first year. Jensen's experience was nearly identical. 7 years in isolation, watching his marriage disintegrate, his family scatter. Both men lost their pensions. Their law enforcement certifications were revoked nationwide, their names entered into databases that would prevent them from ever working in security, corrections, or any position of authority again. When Morrison was finally released, he was 51 years old with a felony record and a 9-year gap in his employment history. He found work on the night shift at a warehouse lifting boxes for minimum wage. He lived in a studio apartment and avoided eye contact with neighbors. Jensen emerged at 39, took a job at a fast food restaurant, and struggled with depression that he couldn't afford to treat. Outro plus Legacy 200. Judge Harris returned to the federal bench, but what happened in her home changed how she approached every case that came before her. She became a powerful voice for police reform, testifying before Congress about the accountability gaps that allowed officers like Morrison and Jensen to operate for years. The security footage from her home became mandatory training material at the FBI Academy in more than 2,400 police departments across the country. Her message was simple and devastating. If this can happen to a federal judge in her own home, imagine what ordinary citizens face every day when there are no cameras, no credentials, no power to fight back. The department she'd forced to reform underwent complete transformation. Mandatory bias training, civilian oversight with investigative authority body cameras on every officer, transparent complaint processes. Recruitment improved as more diverse candidates applied to join a force that had finally started rebuilding trust. 3 years after that morning in her driveway, data showed stops of Black residents in affluent neighborhoods had dropped 74%. Judge Harris still served on the bench, still tended her roses and silk pajamas, still baked cookies for the block party. But now everyone knew justice wasn't just her profession. It was her legacy, bought with dignity and paid for with courage. This case proves that standing up changes everything. But the story you're about to see next, even more shocking.